Welcome back to the 2021 Virtual Residency Workshop, Introductory, Intermediate, Advanced. This is Thursday, June 10th, the late afternoon session. Our session is Development of Profession, a Research Computing and Data Community. Our speaker is Scott Yokels. Scott, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I met most of you yesterday, so I don't really need an introduction. I have spent a lot of time in the last, I guess since 2017, engaging with the Campus Research Computing Consortium, which you probably hear as CARC a lot of times. And so today I want to tell you kind of a story of the timeline of things and events that have happened, and then kind of interweave, how it's affected roles and stuff like that I control within Harvard, which is the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Research Computing Department. So essentially, Campus Research Computing Consortium is an organization of us that are from a number of different institutions that are really trying to dedicate on developing, advocating for, and advancing the research computing and data, or you might see it as CI, profession, right? And this is not just the infrastructure, this is also the humans, right? So there's a number of activities. There's a professional community, right, where you can connect with. There's a number on a kind of monthly or multi-month basis. There's a working groups, and so the professionalization, workforce development working group, and then there's capabilities model working group. There's a few others that have come and gone throughout the years. And there's also interest groups, which is a place for you to discuss. So you can see how to join. This just kind of shows just a graphic of what I just described. So these professionalization and capabilities models are working groups that are continuing on. There's things like stakeholder and value proposition that you can see have kind of done their job and made their product, and now have gone dormant until something new comes. One of the things I will say I really enjoyed, and I don't think I would have understood this at the beginning, but the idea that there is a logistics group and a communications group, and there's an active charter and things like that seems really boring. But when I've gone to other virtual organizations, or now even inside of Harvard, as we are working virtually all the time across multiple schools, it's really, really important to understand how you operate as a team, how you organize your files, how you take minutes, how you assign tasks. And I would say that the logistics group has really, really, really made that a much more streamlined process in CARC, and that's led to some of our success. So just hats off to those folks. Another thing to say is that CARC is very open to collaboration and partnerships, with Campus Champions and CASC and EDUCAUSE and Internet 2. And so like the capabilities model, there's a partnership between EDUCAUSE and Internet 2. So today's topic, why professionalize research computing and data? Like, why do we need this? Are we not just IT? There's a lot of those kinds of conversations that have come out over the last 4 or 5 years that I've involved in, at least. And there's some severe challenges. There's a national shortage of positions being filled, right? There are positions out there. It's hard to fill them. It's hard to get people who have the right skill set, who have the right mentality, to be in like a real service mindset, and those kinds of things that you really want to engage with researchers. It's a different space to be in. It's also challenging because there's not really a formal career path, right? There's very little awareness in the people who come into this career. Like, they didn't know about it, and they just kind of happened upon it. That's not going to be a successful way to build a pipeline for future professionals, right? There are events like this one that you're at today that Henry's been doing that help kind of bring up the staffing that we have, but we don't have very many things that are where do we find the next group of people? There was a presentation as a keynote, I believe, at Supercomputing. I can't even guess now. It's been too many years since I feel like I've been there in person. But that a vast majority of those who are a graduate student or a postdoc do not go on to an academic faculty tenure track position. Thus, there is a lot of people who would be ripe and have a lot of skill sets in the computational space to come into the space, but they just don't know about it. Faculty do not promote this by and large because they promote becoming faculty like themselves. It's also hard in the training side of things. There's not a rich amount of training materials. If you looked at enterprise IT, there's huge swaths of organizations that provide all sorts of different training for that style of development. It's also really hard to, in our past and prior, our prior organizational structures at our universities, how do we develop and promote these individuals? Most of the organizations are really flat. There's no growth. There's one person on top and then there's everybody else. It's really challenging in a small team and stuff like that. So how do we work with HR to do that? And that's because that's what we do. The goal is to recruit and retain top talent, right? We know we will have employee turnover, but that's fine when there's a pipeline coming in. And that's what's hard, is not having that pipeline. The other thing is that this is truly a unique space from what we call administrative or enterprise IT, right? Working with researchers, being on the edge of technology where there's not a lot of manuals, there's not a lot of documentation for various different software and processes and open source things that we typically use, right? It's a different type of space. And the other aspect that's hard is that there's kind of a precarious employment in this space as well. There's actually a lot of research computing data professionals that are embedded as a part of research computing groups, but they're on soft funded money, right? We have mixtures of soft funded money, even in my department in research computing, with research software engineers that are all on soft funded money. So how do we build a career for somebody when the funding sources are really unstable from year to year? I will point you to a paper to check out, professionalization in cyber infrastructure. Here, you have it in your notes. It's a pretty good read. It's about the background on some of this. So today I'll talk to you about this timeline. I actually literally created last night. I've been thinking about doing this for a while, and I'm glad that this talk kind of pushed me over the edge to give it. And so this is kind of a timeline of the path of thinking about CI or RCD professionalization. And back in 2016 is where we'll start, and we'll end up with the things that are most current. And so at the high level, I'm just going to read kind of like what happened each year, and then throughout the talk, I'm going to go into deep detail on each of these. So there was a number of research coordinating network meetings. So some the RC directors and organizational sociologists deliberated on like, should CI be a profession or not? And then from that and out of that came the facings term introduced, how we describe what people do or what they face on a daily basis. And then shortly in that same time frame, at the end of the RCN meetings is when CARC was formalized and created, kind of at the end of when the ACI grant ended, we started the CARC organization. And then within the professionalization working group that came out of that, we've done a workshop in 2018. We had another working group that created a job filling matrix in 2019. Right now, there's a workforce survey that's open, which I'll talk to at the end, and career arcs as like trying to describe what does that look like for the RCD profession that's currently open. And at the very end, I'll tell you a little bit about some NSF funding that we just received. So, whoa, what just happened? Oh, it went into, I didn't mean to click on it went into edit mode. Sorry. You still see the full screen of the slides? Let me pop out.
Yes. Well,
It's pretty full.
You did.
Well, now it's not.
There. That was weird. It like went into edit mode on my slide, on my graphic. Okay, so one of the outcomes from the 2016 RCN, 2017 RCN was the understanding of where at in the professionalization process should we think about research computing and data, or in this slide it calls it research IT. So should we have an established association? Should we formalize and disseminate our knowledge base, right? Step 3 would be implementing education programs for professionals and organizational, like this is a good example. Like this is almost an educational program that it's a workshop style, but like should there be more formal education programs? So there'd be certificates, things like that you could get, similar to how like data science, like you could get a data science certificate at some point before it became a degree. So the follow-on after that would be more formalized things, right? Like working on curriculum in a university. That's a much more established long-term vision of any discipline, right? Beyond that, and then you create a graduate degree, and you would establish like all sorts of local chapters, and you create institutions. This is what you would do right now, like in law and medicine, right? They have really defined and strict requirements to get into that space. And then you would even incubate startup and professional service firms that do research computing, and data come in and do that for an institution. The problem is those last steps, those are not inclusive steps, right? Those are to be exclusive, to say we only want the top notch of these people, and we want to like provide all these guardrails before you get to that space. That's the opposite of what we need. Right now, we need more and more people to help researchers with the endless amounts of new technology options and navigating that. So I would just advise that we stop at the third spot, and that's what we talked about in those meetings. And what that does is it makes research computing and data professional much more of an apprentice style, much more that you would have kind of in a gilded fashion. So with that, we need to think about how do we get to that space. And so just to tell you quickly about the working group itself, we call professionalization the process by which we organize ourselves, right? And ensure that the practitioners perform the services, and that it's its own distinct occupation. That's an important part of it. And that we find ourselves integral to scholarly research, right? So that's what we mean when we say professionalization of research computing and data. And like I said before, the value that we're searching for is attracting, retaining, diversifying, developing the talent. How will we do that within this working group is to develop and disseminate frameworks, and where we work with the leading parts of IT and HR and research that would hopefully elevate our status of positions and make them a distinct and highly valued career path, right? So that's kind of where we're at. So how have we done on that? We've done kind of 3 different activities. We had a professionalization workshop where we wanted to learn from a few of the research IT shops that have what we thought done this definition in career path space. We wanted to develop some kind of flexible framework that people could use in the hiring process. That was one of the complaints that we had from surveys. We wanted to apply this framework. We wanted to work across the different roles and facings, which we were defined in that workshop. So the workshop really kind of validated the concept of these that came out of the RCN. And so I'm going to break away from this bulleted list and kind of dive into a little more specifics on each of the facings, just in case you're unfamiliar with them. So when we think about systems facing, we think about there's a spectrum, right? And what this means to describe is that like, it doesn't mean that every institution would have the whole spectrum. You might have a place where you partner with part of this with another organization. So the data center would be at the far left, right, where it's just the actual facility of the place that we put stuff. In some instances, so like in mine, we have the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center. It's something that's a part of my infrastructure. Like the cost and the decisions about the data center in itself are part of what I have to worry about as an organization. And people in my system space, so like the associate director of systems and operations, has to deal with all the way down to that level. But you may partner, and maybe enterprise IT takes care of your data center, right? And so you just have to worry about the physical systems and the virtualized layers, right? If you were only operating in the cloud, you wouldn't have physical systems, right? You'd be the other part of the stack. So it's a lot. It's not just one of these. It's this whole spectrum of things that's on the systems facing side. So on the researcher facing side, you engage with researchers. That's why it's called researcher facing. So this would be facilitators and user support and all software, support help on using the cluster. And so you are trying to create solutions. So sometimes in my group, we joke that these are the solutioneers. You engage with them. I think this concept of co-create and co-learn, which I'll define later, is a really, really important concept that's distinct to the facilitation and really sets it apart of what would just be user support from a central IT organization or enterprise IT organization. And then you do a lot of helping coordinate and collaborate across multiple places, both in technology and research. You are the person, like we said yesterday, that knows a lot about what's happening in the research that uses technology landscape. And you also connect externally to the research community with things like that we're on here today. And then, solving problems, enhancing the learning, and making people understand that there's a whole set of skills that they should learn to be good stewards of doing research properly, is kind of the mission. And on software or data facing, there's a bunch of different kind of aspects that are, depending on what domain you're coming from, different parts of this are going to be more important. So you may have to do things that are more on the system admin side or software engineering side or training or compliance. And it really just depends on where you are on which kind of scientific domain or research domain of which of these things is more important. And so your responsibilities kind of like, flow and overlap amongst these. And that's kind of the drawing we created. And then there's the strategy and policy facing, where you're the leader and you're having to deal with all sorts of different stakeholders and coming up with the policies and ways in which you operate, strategy to make this business sustainable over time, and hopefully convince your institutional board of those things. So you have different things that you're involved in. So the other kind of points in the workshop were, can we create this framework across a diverse set of campuses? That's also really challenging. And can we create a framework, that would be useful to further the profession along? And so a couple of common themes that came out of that, like I said, the co-creation, which I just talked about, it's that we have to learn the research problem and what they're trying to do from the kind of workflow to be able to suggest. So we don't come in as a consultant like we are the all-knowing power that comes in and says, this is how you should do it. We have to kind of craft those solutions together, right? Career paths came up over and over, which touches on the career arcs work that's going on now. The concept of the word digital. Digital shows up all over the place, all over everything now. The status. We really, in a lot of the university space, work in a multi-tiered system of culture where there's faculty, there's students, and then there's staff. And it's a very hard power dynamic to get settled correctly. And I think a lot of institutions are wrestling with that currently, especially, it's been highlighted throughout the pandemic, but I think this is a place where there's a lot of interest to how do we do better in that space, and how do we tell our story better, that we're representing the great work that the professionals do. And then just the terminology, you've already heard me say the word CI, research, computing, data, and research IT. Like, that's three names for basically the same stuff. We keep using lots of different words. It's hard because that makes it difficult for us to communicate to researchers when they don't understand what we're talking about, because we keep changing the terminology words. Okay, so that brings us to 2019. So one of the things you thought about is so in the professionalization workshop, there is a job elements and career guide that you can go to products on the CARC website and you can read. It's written in kind of in a prose format. It's about 30 pages. It really kind of goes into details of defining the roles and responsibilities. And out of that, when we had like an informal kind of back and forth from different times that we presented, people said, I could really use something I could take to HR. So that was the next body of work that we did. Dang it, I did it again. I'll have to figure out how not to do that next time. Why does it want to edit this? Sorry. I gotta figure out how to not do that next time. Okay. So, so this group below, a mixture of some of us that were directors like Wayne and myself, and those who are leads of facilitation or on the system side or communication side, and also HR related, met over a 6-week period of time. And we would go through this iterative process every single week. And we were actually started from a framework that was used in enterprise IT by Stanford and Harvard, and kind of used that. and we would go through and craft the series for each of the facings. And then at the end, we would review it. We sent that out to a number of participants from the workshop, got comments and incorporated those, and then we had our first framework. I can't really show you what is like a 8-page Excel sheet in a presentation, so you can go and download it, but I will try in this format to show you kind of what I mean. One of the things that I didn't know much about, and I learned a lot through this process, is how does HR look at jobs on your campus? So most universities, there are about 12 or so top level job functions. And job function, for most of us, is information technology. It could be research. Other job functions that exist out there are like library, museums sometimes, and then you would have like HR and security and all those kinds of, but there's not very many top level functions. So inside of that, there's a job family. The job family describes the uniqueness of what you do. And it was really important to establish that research computing should be its own unique job family, and that our positions should not be a part of just the IT infrastructure, right? Like our systems people are not IT infrastructure and central IT. They do different work than that. The responsibilities and the breadth of the things they do are different. So we had to argue that on each one of these that we had, because we had HR IT people as a part of the working group. And I feel like we were pretty successful doing that and couldn't have done the work without the HR folks there. So inside of a job plan is a job series, right? And so the series name is what takes on then your levels. And so I'll highlight this for the systems facing one. So we ended up defining systems professionals 1 through 5, so 5 grades, where a lot of our schools only had 3 in the past. And the most important part is now that we have individual contributors who could have a position and ranking equivalent to a manager or a senior manager, right? So this could be like a lead or a principal engineer or architect in that case. And that was what was really missing, and one of the things that we were trying to really focus on. So inside of the framework, there's like a little cell for each one of these things. The business title, the core duties, and the skills part are the places that have a lot more flexibility that you can kind of alter and change. But the job title goes like, RC Systems Professional 1. That's the actual HR job title. Those things stay fixed. The job summary, we spent a huge amount of effort on to get correct. And it's really a 3-sentence summary. It has to, over the course of all 5 levels, show the increase in responsibility and autonomy, and things like that. So it's really important that that language stays pretty fixed. The core duties, we have a suggestion of what they all should look like, and that same kind of language of progression increases as the core duties transitions. Most of the qualification skills are just like a couple of suggestions, but that's the place where a lot of the customization of what skills do you need for that specific set of tasks goes. And then the minimum and basic qualifications should stay fixed, because otherwise the different levels really doesn't make sense. And in your institution, you may not be able to use all 5, you may only be able to use 4, and that's where you have to make decisions. But you feel free to go to products and look for the job family, and you can download it there. And it'll just ask you like who you are, because that way I have somebody to follow up with, see how it's going. There were some points of concerns. The non-managerial career path, which we feel like we addressed. The distinctness from enterprise IT, which I mentioned multiple times now. And then there are obviously roles that are intentionally left out. It's not meant to encompass your entire department, because you could have people that are part of research administration, business operations, finance, things like that. They're in other functions. It doesn't mean they're not in your department. It just means they're not in the research computing and the data profession directly, even though they have some overlap, especially like in library. Anyhow, and then other points of concerns was the education versus experience. This really came up in the research facing, and we decided to actually in the review process to roll back and say, look, we're going to treat education as a type of experience when it goes with the skill set. And we're just going to say the number of total experience that's the minimum. So it really puts education in a less specific space for each of these. And I think that's really important to break down the barrier, that if somebody has tremendous background and skills, but they chose that after they had their education choices, that we don't penalize them, because otherwise we're losing out on people that would otherwise apply. And that's one of the problems, that we need more people to apply. And the software and data facing, like on the CARC website, there are 2 different tracks. We have different like phone call tracks and stuff like that kind of planned out in that space that should happen. But to be honest, in HR terminology, the function by what they perform and their core duties are really the same. Their audience of who they're working with and their skill set and the additional skills are what change. So it's not like they still go and work with faculty. They still are very much a part of the research process. Like they're more closely related to research than maybe the facilitations are, with the systems people on the back. So all of that still worked really well together. So we just had one series for those. And then we created multiple director levels, mostly to demonstrate that they could be commensurate with the other people that this leader has as a peer at the institution. So they could be a director, they could be a senior director, they could be like an AVP. It just really depends on where they fit in that organizational structure in the director space. So let me get a time check. All right. So when we implemented this at Harvard, about 6 months after the framework was created, so we're going to touch on a couple of things so that you're aware. Like when you take a framework like this to HR and you want to start to try to implement it, you're going to have to make decisions, right, around different things. And one of them was around data science. At Harvard, data scientists as a role is a research function, and that's challenging because most research functions, there's not a lot of professional staff. There's a lot of short-term positions that are grant funded. So you don't have a lot of senior professionals in that space. So that when you do an equity review, that becomes challenging because you're comparing against the body of people who are in that same function. And technology, the pace and the change of the positions happens more regularly to be updated. So that's something to consider. And we ended up saying we'll put them and move them into the technology function. Bioinformatics, the same way. They're a research function currently at Harvard, and we decided to leave them as a research function because they're more closely aligned to some of the scientific staff positions that are amongst the core facilities and genetics and stuff like that. So do you call the people consultants or facilitators when it comes to the researcher facing space? And we were pretty split 50-50 across the university, but the facilitators slightly won out. But those terms resonate differently with different people, right? And actually it was in the business, Harvard Business School, that really liked using the word facilitator because consultant at the business school meant a very specific thing. And they wanted to convey more of the facilitation and working with researchers, not a person who's hired in to do the research. That would be a consultant on their space. It was very hard to convince the university to have a level 4 or 5 individual contributor. There was a lot of pushback. And I argued that we don't have a career path then described for these people. And if you really want to, so we started out and we didn't have anybody in level 4 and 5, which their argument was then you're not going to have good equity review. It's like, we can find other positions, that are commensurate to compare to within enterprise IT, if we need to. So we actually won that case. And now, year and a half later, we have, I think, 4 or 5 across the university lead positions, so level 4, and 1 architect position, level 5, they're individual contributors. So that was nice to see. The thing that I was not in favor of that did happen, it was that they lowered the management from a level 4 down to level 3. And I didn't want that to happen because I thought all the management should start at that other level. And it also made it difficult to then take 2 of the managers who were at what this was level 3 and then promote them right away, because now there was a slot for them to fit into. So there are drawbacks and caveats when you have it planned out and when you start to actually implement something. And it turned out also at Harvard, they don't do leadership and stakeholder facing roles in this framework. They have a whole other system for it. So that whole part just got scrapped. So the other thing it did is it identified many positions outside of the centralized RC groups that were in the research computing and data profession. And now every time a faculty wants to create a position, it goes to the review process. They bring it up. I normally become one of the subject matter experts if it's within my college. And we start to really make them pick, is this a research software engineer or is this a facilitator? Can you get this bioinformatics support function through the bioinformatics team and then just create a software engineer? You have to really make them choose an actual position that matches what would be the expertise instead of having someone do everything inside of the lab. So that's a really good benefit, I think, of the university. I think I said that right. Okay. I'll try to advance and not click on this time. So we're going to head on to 2020 when we started the so this last summer, there was an NSF workshop hosted by Purdue on CI workforce. And out of that came a number of different ideas and things that were important. It was really interesting to see some of the themes from the 2018 workshop that only like, I think 35 of us were a part of. And now in a group of 100 participants, a much broader audience, it was starting to really resonate with them. So this is quite a bit of text. I'll just kind of read the bold stuff. Need to work on the awareness of a unique career path. HR job families came up, defining career arcs, educate, the other parts of the university about the roles, create compensation, that's more commensurate to our work, career paths, promotion models, things like that. Diversity, equity, inclusion. How do we promote organizations like CARC and EDUCAUSE and CASC and Campus Champions, like those things that are actually doing this type of stuff. And then thinking about the national census of positions, pay grades, cost of living differences, that kind of stuff. So you can see there's a lot of things that are around who is research computing and data professionals in various different forms here. So a spinoff group from that I was in, I already had the idea to we should have a census, but I just hadn't had a working group to do it. We started a working group in December. It quickly became a much more, it seemed like an easy thing to do, and then it became much harder. We looked at a lot of other censuses and surveys, and finally in April, we sent out what we had worked on for months to beta test, got lots of reviews incorporated, submitted to IRB approval, and now the survey is open. So that's really exciting to get to that point. And so we'll be on hiatus as a working group for the summer, and then start to think about how we analyze the data at the end of the year. So it's really aimed to provide the first large data set. So we would like to see 1,000 people provide data to this, so we can understand the things that we were just seeing on the previous slide. What are the demographics? Who is the research computing data workforce? What are their job responsibilities? Now that we have a framework, do they even map to that kind of stuff? What are their job types? What are their compensations? We don't have any data when we go to HR to compare to other universities when it comes to compensation. And HR desperately needs that, because I think there's a lot of inequities across different institutions and stuff in this space. And hope we can bring ourselves all up a little bit. And then we also ask questions about their perception of the RCD field. So I can't make this more obvious. Please take the survey. Survey is anonymous. There's only one PI that gets to see the data that will munge the data. And we use all sorts of the common principles to keep things secret. We have to have enough sample sizes allocated together, right? So it's about an 18-minute survey in total. And not just you, but take it back to your institution, please. Give it to everybody you know. We'd like to really promote this. I think it'll be a great resource. This is one thing that sets apart what most professional societies and organizations have. They have an annual workforce survey. They provide all sorts of stats and things like that. We'd like to publish the high level of this data amongst the different types of institutions, the different Carnegie classes, the underrepresented institutions compared to public and private, those types of things we'd like to be able to do a good study of. So hopefully just a few minutes at the end, we can talk about what's the type of data that you would like to have and how would it smash up together with things that you're interested in. So keep that in mind. And I got 2 slides left, I believe. So Patrick Schmitz, one of my co-chairs of the working group has launched this spring into a working group activity thread of creating career arcs resources. So they are trying to define how do we get the information and learn about how people got into this career? How should we disseminate that in a framework? What's a good way to like tell that story and make it useful for people? How's it useful for hiring managers and people like that that can work with their groups on that? So there's a lot of interest in that space. You can see it on the website. You can sign up and so I think the career arcs is going to be a really interesting thing. I think there'll be some really good stories that come out and hopefully, you know, help people even within our, like, how do you go from, you know, something like user support to, you know, research software engineer? Like, how does that track look? How do I gain skill set? How do I transition from being purely a researcher to doing research computing and data facilitation? Like, what are the different kind of steps along the way? How do I go from a field that's somewhat related, you know, into this space? I think we'll have a lot from these stories. So check that out. And just to recap from earlier, individuals largely don't understand RCD as a career. Hopefully we're doing things to make the career path structure better, to elevate the awareness. It's still hard to recruit staff because it's hard to find them. I think through things like this, we're getting better at training them, like this program here today. And then, but the development and promotion part is still a challenge. I don't think we have done a good enough job with the institutional leadership to elucidate the value of these people and the research process. Like most of our facilitation staff are like experts in the research process when it comes to using technology, right? So how do we make them shine? So, and then another thing that happened just recently, a group of us led by Dana, and then myself and Patrick Schmitz and Claire and Tom have come together, and we have a pilot grant to really think about creating a research computing and data career center for individuals and a resource center for institutions. So how do we take some of the stuff that all these different working groups have created and create a much more kind of professional looking dashboard and interactive space and a whole set of materials that really kind of brings us up? That's what we'll be doing over the next 18 months or 2 years time. So any time for questions and discussion, happy to spend the last few minutes. So we have something in chat. If the structure had been in place 5 years ago, you would have been entirely excluded from the career path I'm currently on. Interesting. Maybe Dina, do you want to like explain that a little bit?
Sure. The structure that you were laying out was very, you have a distinct split between the people who do research and the people who do enterprise IT, and no mention of the overlaps with the boundaries, and a prerequisite of if you're going to be a facilitator or consultant type of person, then you have to already previously be a researcher. All of these would have knocked me out of any consideration of being anywhere on this path.
There's nothing in the framework that says to be a facilitator, you had to have been a researcher. We have people who have come directly from undergrad, but to have that kind of mindset in their willingness to help people and willingness to learn, that's been important. And I think that's the part of it, is that willingness to learn and think outside of the box and create solutions where it's not obvious ones. That's the most important on the facilitation side. Research computing job family is a part of the IT function. So thus there is a lot of overlap in the qualities and skills that we would need that some enterprise IT people do have. I think one distinct thing that happens is in the ladder of responsibility in the job function, or sorry, in the job family for research computing, is as you go up the ladder, your skill need and breadth of responsibilities gets much broader, as opposed to, so like if you're going to be a top, like a principal facilitator and help somebody with a really complex issue, you have to know all about how the IO and the compute and parallelization and all of these different facets that are part of what the systems folks are deploying, how they all operate, because you're trying to map it to this like really complex technology stack. So I see a lot of times in enterprise IT, as you go up the ladder, your focus gets narrow and you become the expert in a very specific vertical. Like I might be the expert at Oracle Financials, right? I'm an architect of that for all of campus, but I'm not doing Oracle Financials and architecting all of these other systems at the same time. So that's, I think, the distinctness of why we created the family was mostly because of that. But it was not trying to be, it's not meant to be exclusive. We have had people from enterprise IT come into our group and be successful, and some not. It just really depends, I think, on the person, not what they've done in the past. So hopefully that helps describe that better, and if any others have questions on it. Does that help, Dina?
Not really, but I'm just,
Okay.
you might want to take a look at the slide that says it's very important for your facilitators to already be researchers then, because I got a pretty clear turn-off impression from that slide.
It's very useful because you have been in their shoes before, but it's not a requirement, no. And that I'm also presenting on stuff that was from the 2018 workshop, and so I'm presenting on material that a lot of people put together, right? I'm not going to change it because I would need to ask 30 institutions to update that data. But thank you for the feedback. The question next came from Keith. Do you find any equity data for composition when dealing with HR? We're hoping to create it in the survey, to be honest. The equity data that we have when we deal with HR is based upon the current positions that we have. So it's very hard if your whole of your group has been low in equity in comparison to some other job series or function for a long period of time. And it's very difficult because you can't just instantly change all the people normally. That's very hard. It's hard to map the research computing data positions to local industry as well. So that's some of the challenges around the equity. Some institutions like University of Florida have spent a lot of time trying to map, because we have a small number of people doing a really large breadth of things. That's where it becomes very challenging to say and go and look, do you do this very specific thing? Whereas like in a large IT organization, like enterprise IT normally has large numbers of people. They do a much more specific thing. It's harder to map that to the research computing data space. And does anyone see an opportunity to share out ACIRF positions that allow folks to work remotely? That's a good question. I know a lot of universities are changing their work flexibility policy, especially for the fall. And so at Harvard, we have the main campus in Cambridge, and then there's the River, and then the Boston campus, which is where the health sciences campus, or the Longwood Medical area. And we provide services to School of Public Health. And like a year before the pandemic, we transitioned to stop doing in-person office hours over there because it was hard to schedule space for it every year because we're in classrooms and all that. So we just started doing it remotely on Zoom, and that was phenomenal, and people could come in. And so on those consultation and facilitation, because you're always most of the time you're going to share like laptop screens and stuff like that. Like it's easier to just share back and forth, see what the person's doing, than having to like, huddle and lean over each other's space. And we also have done trainings like that for a couple of years, and I don't think it's any less successful remotely connecting with people for those than it is to do them in person. I think you lose a little bit of that kind of whiteboard diagram kind of space, but for basic kind of support areas and stuff like that, I think it works well remotely. Thanks, Amy. Amy was part of our working group. Any other questions? Kimberly brings up, do you think it is wise to cross-train between career tracks? Yes, I really do. And I would say that most institutions don't have enough people to actually have teams of these different job series. And so you'll find that the roles and responsibilities that are in those, people are doing a lot of them across, like as a cross-training experience. The more technology that a researcher, like a researcher-facing person, a facilitator has, I think the better advice that they can give towards, like, they're really like a concierge, right? They should be knowledgeable about all this stuff and help researchers navigate that, right? So if they knew things like, we've had people who were facilitator working with somebody that had this issue with R and it wasn't working correctly as the data set size grew. Well, R turns out to be 32-bit on the back end and the data size couldn't fit in the matrix anymore. Had they just switched to Python and used Pandas framework for this huge matrix of information, you know, like if you just know that stuff exists, even if you're not great at it, you just know the nuts and bolts of it, right? So you're not a software, you know, you're not a programmer in the sense of Python, but if you know those kinds of things, you can be much more effective at helping navigate solutions. So that's just kind of one example. And the mindset to work with researchers, I think, is also different. The way in which you might write to them and tickets and stuff might be different. I think Henry, you guys wrote this diagram a long time ago about the difference between people and things. Some people are better at dealing with people. Some people are better at dealing with things like the servers and stuff. So it doesn't mean that everybody is, but it's very important to have a more thorough kind of discussion around things when you're talking about building solutions for people, and not just if you're super knowledgeable on the system side, just saying, here it is, this is it, or I fixed it, or like, this is what you should do. Like kind of shorter answers, because it's completely obvious because you live in the technology world all the time, you know. So other questions came up from David. Does anyone have any idea or any data for how long it takes to hire a CI professional? So that was one of the things that we originally in our working group we're going to do. We were going to create 2 surveys, one for individuals and one for like managers or directors. And we were going to go after that kind of information, like how long is the position open to close, other things like that a senior director would know, like the ratio of people, like the ratio of facilitators to the number of research groups that they serve, the ratio of systems engineers to the number of devices that they manage, you know, things like that. Like there's some other data like that we would like to get at, but we decided to stop with the individual survey. Anyhow. And then what else? Yeah, it's a good point that Dana brought up, though, that we're defining roles and responsibilities. We're not writing out who people are. We're trying to define a comprehensive view of the roles and responsibilities that you have to accomplish, you know, maintaining within your department as a whole. Like, for example, one of our lead facilitators runs Slurm. Like he's not in the systems group, right? But he runs Slurm. One of the other ones in that group, he runs Open on Demand, right? So like they end up having different technologies that they're maintaining. But they still, you know, like their primary function is as a facilitator. So it doesn't mean that your secondary function is not a system admin, right? So I think that's important for people to understand. I can't remember how long we're going till, Henry. It's 5:05 here.
Quarter after.
Okay. I mean, like, it's good to know. We didn't really talk about it. I had those questions up there earlier, but like, there's been one comment about the type of data that you would like to see, like, because in the survey itself, there's like individual questions about the person itself, you know, themselves, like their demographic, the amount of experience that they had prior to coming to the position they're in now, how long they've been in the position, things like that. Then there's questions about the role that they're in, which kind of goes up with some of the facings, like what percentage of the time do you do these kinds of functions within your department, and then what other things did you not list there in those 5 that you had to pick. And then the other thing is about job satisfaction and just career outlook kind of questions. We were hoping to be able to pull together, like, are some people feel more satisfied in the position across different roles, or what do the demographics look like in the different facings and stuff like that, or do they change? Do we have an age discrepancy between systems people and facilitators? And you're like, there could be things like that we could look at. There's ways to cross-cut the data, is all I'm trying to say. And it'd be interesting if you guys have thoughts about things that you have been interested in that space, or that you think are a challenge for hiring, that you want to see us look at in the data.
Sorry, I misspoke. It's 1/2 past, not quarter after.
I'm going to go back, Scott, to kind of Dina's comments. And, as we've talked about these roles and the framework, the intent is not at all to put up barriers to entry, right? And we've talked about that quite a bit in the various groups, is that, when you think of professions like medicine and law and others, one of the things of a profession is to put up barriers to entry so that you have this kind of exclusive group that dominates a knowledge area. And, there's, at least my feeling is we don't want to do that, right? There's too many people, and we like the diversity of backgrounds that various people bring to the community. And that's why a lot of the training programs like this one are so useful, that anybody who wants to can come and learn and come from other disciplines and bring their perspectives to this profession. And so I think, while this framework is, one place where we have gotten to define these things because we felt like it was needed, is by no means meant to let anybody feel like they don't belong as part of it, right?
Yeah, and there's been a number of workshops on like how to more appropriately write job descriptions so you don't alienate people who apply. And we try to stay with some of those principles too when we created the framework that we created. Like in that's why originally in the researcher facing, there was an educational requirement as you went up the ladder that there was a master's or a PhD to become a certain manager level. And then we got pushback from the review of the group from 2018. And that's why we said, okay, yeah, we should just drop that. And we should actually not do that anywhere then. We should make sure that the educational requirements and experience kind of go hand in hand as like we're adding them together. And that was to not alienate people. And there's no criteria in any of the minimums or the skills that require people to have ever been a researcher, like in the framework itself. So people are going to come from all sorts of different paths. And I think that's what makes the environment rich within your department, is when you can get that. Yeah, so I mean, that was a 2018 thing, and in 2019 we revised it when we created the actual framework that people are using as a template to get rid of the minimums. So these things are a progression of thought as well. I mean, other, I don't know if I've gotten, scroll back to all of these. So Harrison poked about hiring challenges. Oh, you're recruiting, that's good. Always good. So like in my experience, the facilitator positions, like we tried to create a cloud, this is also in the pandemic, so that kind of skews time frame, but like we created a senior facilitator for cloud. Like we want a cloud facilitator, so we focus on the cloud technology, so less on the HPC side, but mostly focus on that. And we've had a position open for it for 7 months and had 10 people apply, right? And that's what's challenging. It's like you have, and the description is, you know, like, I mean, it's part of the framework, so it's not like it's out in left field or anything, but it's just hard to find people who, in the facilitation space, it's hard to find people who have supported working with others in the development of solutions that are not looking for a software engineering gig, right? There is a lot of people who've been consultants and been software engineer and developed all sorts of cool tech. But if it's more about guiding people, that's a harder thing to find people with a background of, and people who like truly and genuinely want to do that, right? Instead of purely creating like a product or something. Where do graduate students, employees fit into the job family framework? So graduate students are a part of the academic job function. They have like most of the time they have a research appointment. So the rules around, like at least at Harvard, the rules around creating a research or an academic appointment are very different than a staff appointment. There's a lot more flexibility and leeway, and so. Can you hire them to be in your department? Yes. And a lot of times we do that through creating either a light employee. So a light would be like less than half time. And in that case, we pay them hourly and they can go on for up to 3 years, I believe. We also do things where we create them as a temp. So a temp you can create as like, you know, full-time work without benefits, but only for 90 days. That actually works really well for graduate students, especially in master's programs, who want to work the summer. Like they don't have, say, a research thing over the summer, or they don't have funding over the summer. And so they don't really fit in the framework because the framework is designed for their professional track. So, but you can align them to, you know, like the facings if you want it, like the job series if you wanted to. But that's where they fall outside of that HR framework. It's a good question here. Untapped resource. I have to check this out for people who used to be research coordinators or research managers. So Kimberly, can you elaborate more on what the responsibilities of the research coordinator or research manager are? Like at Harvard, we have lab managers. It would be good to understand what you mean in that space.
Hi, hi Scott. So I actually come from a background as a research coordinator. Oh, can you hear me pretty well?
Yes, you can hear you just fine.
Okay. I worked as a IRB analyst. I worked as a research coordinator, as a project manager in research in both health as well as campus biological science departments. And I even worked in a wet lab right out of college. But one thing I never really thought about was working in research IT, because at the time that wasn't really a thing that I was aware of. I even came across a job that I have now as a research facilitator at UCSD by chance of looking at a job description and saying, hey, that looks like something I could possibly do. And, you know, thankfully my supervisor agreed. So, but my whole point is, I think a lot of researchers, and by research coordinator, I mean working in data management and working with vendors and research, study startups, proposal writing. So all of those kind of things were things that I was involved in. And as a research coordinator, I burnt out. It was so much work, and it was so much keeping up with new technologies, new data management systems, you know, going from one application to another, that I found that I thought about preferring that over actually working with those kind of systems than actually learning something new each time and trying to associate it with research. And I was the one that always had to train new staff on, okay, I learned how to do this. This is how you do it. Show my researcher, this is how you do it. And so by working in this position, I found that I was essentially doing the job that I do now in a research coordinator position.
Right.
So I really feel that if outreach is done that targets, you know, research coordinators and research managers, it really is an option to bring in, you know, this untapped resource of knowledge that's been entrenched in the research world so heavily, but also been exposed to research technologies.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a really good point. So I would imagine for most people, it's probably more straightforward to teach somebody who understands the research process, which is a lot of the things that you picked up through these different things. It's easier to teach somebody that has that understanding, technology year over year, than it is to take somebody who really understands technology, who knows nothing about the research process and how it happens at an academic institution, and try to teach them that and be good at that. And so I completely agree with what's great about your story, I thought, was that, and this is like perfect for like something like the career arcs, like how do we tell like how someone transitions from one to another, and what was that process like? And the technology part, you could really, you know, pretty pedantically teach somebody this skill set of technology and then kind of progress it year over year and really kind of do that. And it's the thing that you just said, that you were the one that went in and figured the thing out. You bootstrapped yourself, right, to figure out the piece of technology that was needed to then show somebody else. And I think that is the mindset that the facilitator is really important. It's kind of more of an art form of being a facilitator than it is, like, it's not really the technical part. It's the art of having to learn new things all the time and then engage. Because like researchers are going to come to you with all sorts of different stuff. Like they're going to pick up some different code and be like, I want to use this. And if you can help them navigate that, then you provide them a lot of value. So that's a really good story. I'm trying to catch up now on these. So Dina pointed out of the 6 facilitators I can think of at our school, 5 of the 6 are definitely graduates of the LIS school, which is probably Library of Information Sciences. Is that right, Dina? But yeah, yeah, you're gonna find facilitators from various different backgrounds and stuff, for sure. Yeah, and one of when we did the 20 to comment on Matt's comment about Google and Amazon hire with no degree requirements, one when we did the 2018 workshop, we had, I can't remember, I think it was somebody from Intel or maybe it was Google as well. We had a few people who had been at a university who we knew of that were at, and they talked about that. They talked about those types of things. And that's what I think a lot of the directors were really interested in going that way, but it's very challenging because at a university level, HR prescribes that at certain grades, you have to have certain educational requirements. And I think that was the one thing that was challenging that we at Harvard like fought and won in that case. They're like, no, we don't have education requirements. We have this combination. I also should point out that like I've learned a tremendous amount in this space. I don't feel like I'm even close to being knowledgeable of all the HR stuff. I just try to share a little bit of what I've learned in the process. Yeah, I really encourage you guys, if you're interested in telling your story to the career arcs, to reach out to Patrick Schmitz. He would be happy to. So one of the things that they're doing in the career arcs is they're trying to design kind of an intake interview process where they would interview people and create a way in which then they would create themes. Like how do we, it's a very kind of like soft and fuzzy kind of quantitative research, right? How do you take these different types of themes of people's transitions and describe those? It's a good point, Henry. Henry's saying, I don't think it's that hard because we're doing it right now to teach people the research process. I mean, it's a good point. I'm just speaking from my own department when I say these things too. I'm not trying to generalize the way that it is. To touch on Stephanie's question, I think my experience has been that the technical people in our group, the systems folk, they don't really care to learn the research part. It's not that they couldn't, it's that they've chosen not to want to. And they just want to do the technology. That's what their interest is. So it's really, I would say it's more about that than about, so. Any other questions about the products and stuff that we've created thus far? It's good to get feedback on the old stuff, the 2018 stuff, that it could definitely use a revision. It now feels stale after you guys have looked at it a little bit, probably. I mean, I will say that in 2016, the term facilitation was only probably held by a few different institutions. And now we have entire tracks of conferences that are dedicated to it. There's been a huge transition in the whole conversation. And that's really dramatic and fast for a term like that, that there is actually people with their business title as a facilitator that have taken off. So. I'm glad I left plenty of space for discussion because I've given these talks before and I always run short on having discussion time. One of the things that kind of reminded me, one of the things that Dina brought up with the librarians in the discussion in the 2018 workshop, when we talk about the status, the librarians have done a really good job of creating status within the institution as they're not part of the teaching faculty most of the time, but they are still involved in the research process heavily, is that they do have, like, the library appointments are on par with faculty appointments. Some of them actually have like faculty appointments. So that has been used as a conversation piece for a number of years about a model and thinking about the way in which research computing and data professionals could think about approaching administration on the status and how that's went. You guys are very lively in the chat. Any other questions? In the time of our discussion, you could have taken the survey. But I do recommend taking it and sharing it with your colleagues and stuff, though. It'd be very helpful for our cause. That's a good point, Henry. I think the point that Henry made is also a change that's happened dramatically in the view of like the National Science Foundation and others, that prior to kind of the ACIRF grant, the majority of funding that went to like the CI space was for instrumentation, the large scale supercomputing facilities, stuff like that. A small, very small amount of it went to people, and it made it difficult for the campus centers to have facilitators, right? So we mostly just had system admins and didn't do much facilitation. And there was a dramatic shift starting around 2017 or so, where that facilitation term started to really take in, and we've seen a huge increase in a lot of universities, and the ratio of people have changed a lot in what they do. I think we're done then. That's a great topic, Henry, for next year. It'd be great to be able to represent the amount of effort, I think personnel effort, to engage with different disciplines, and not look at, like, a lot of times we look at like computing cycles, which I think is not the right way to think about it, right? Like how much time is needed to get somebody to their discovery space, right? Yeah. As I've
Right,
engaged
Scott,
more.
shall we wrap it up and
Yeah.
go into our wrap-up session? All right,
Go for it.
so first let me stop the recording here.